For our third episode, we are here with our program in Ukraine. You can see Kyiv's Independence Square, where the revolution took place 4 years ago. Ukrainians call it the Revolution of Dignity. The revolution had two goals. One was the European future for Ukraine, and the other one, independence from Russia and its politics. And we are here now, 4 years later, with 3 guests. I would like to ask them, after these 4 years, do you think these goals were achieved? And can you please introduce yourself? Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I would like to say hello to all our friends. And what is really important is that I was a member of the Crisis Committee of the Civic Forum after the Czech Revolution of 1989. I was in charge of the Parliamentary Commission for Withdrawal of the Soviet Army troops from Czechoslovakia. Later, I was an advisor to the then President Václav Havel and then Minister of Human Rights. Also, I'm a rock singer. Let's add that you also participated personally in the Maidan events. That's right, and I also wanted to add that whenever there are such processes in post-Soviet countries, it is important for other countries from this bloc to support them. I read out loud the common letter of the Czechs and Slovaks, and I still feel that even after the breakup of Czechoslovakia, we still share the same values and direction. I am really interested in the events taking place in Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries, and I find the democratic development of these continues very important. There is a need to complete this, because I can see sort of a reverse movement in our country. Hopefully we can stop it, but somehow we are being slightly embraced by Russia again, which might be dangerous. So we need to cultivate our freedom and maintain it. Hanna, can you introduce yourself? What about you? During the Revolution of Dignity, I was quite active here at Maidan, together with other like-minded people. And they work now in the civil society, or together with me in the Ukrainian parliament. And we used to have a civil sector of Euromaidan, which include Yehor Sobolev, Ihor Lutsenko, Volodymyr Vyadorovich, which is now a director of the National Memory Institute, Svetlana Zalushuk, many activists who took over the responsibility after the revolution and went to the parliament. Since 2014, I am the head of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the parliament. International solidarity and support of Ukraine are very important for us, so that the transformation of the country from the post-Soviet and corrupt towards a really democratic country with strong anti-corruption institutions and with the rule of law happen as soon as possible, so that Ukraine would become a part of the big European family, a member of the EU and NATO. And this is one of the most effective ways how to counteract Russian aggression. And I think that successful Ukraine is needed both for the European Union, for the European community, and for the Russian citizens. The success of Ukraine. The only one who doesn't need a strong Ukraine is Putin and Putinism, his regime that is afraid of Ukraine becoming really independent.
Mr. Niakliaeu.
Many nights and many days I spent here at Maidan. We were sleeping in tents. The Hotel Ukraine was right behind us. And, for some reason, we were not let in. This time, I stay at this hotel as a guest. From a quite high floor, I took a look at Maidan from my window. I asked the guard in the corridor, who probably cooperates with special services, whether there had been some shootings from this window during the Maidan. He said that almost from all the windows there had been shootings. It stuck in my head, and I couldn't sleep for the whole night. I would like to continue your thought. Success of Ukraine is for sure necessary for Europe and the world. This is the reason why I was here then, and why I'm here today. The success is necessary for Belarus. Historically, our past is interconnected, and that's why the future of Belarus depends on the future of Ukraine. If Ukraine, European Ukraine member state, is independent, the same state will become Belarus. If something happens here, and the same drama will happen in Belarus, there is one issue: whether you can feel secure in Ukraine having such a neighbor as Russia. There is no necessity to discuss it here, because here people know there is a war in Donbass. The Crimea was annexed, but it is interpreted by Russia as a return of historical lands. Russia poses threat to its neighbors and doesn't recognize that the neighboring countries are independent and sovereign. That's a fact. However, I think that one of the main tasks of our discussion is to find out why it has happened. Mr. Niakliaeu didn't mention one thing. In the Belarusian presidential election, he ran as a candidate against Lukashenko, and later, when he refused the union between Belarus and Russia, he was brutally attacked. So I just wanted to mention this. As Czechoslovakia, we were quite lucky that we are not neighbors of Russia. But, from your point of view, if we look at countries neighboring with Russia, do they have hope for independence? What can we tell them? Our historical experience we can share is that at a certain time, the Soviet Union did not hesitate. If there was the decision, if this giant country had the will for the decision, they did not really hesitate to use the army and weapon in possible volume. The invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 required more than 500,000 soldiers, which is almost impossible to imagine nowadays. It was a huge force, given the current perspective looking back at the situation as in Ukraine. It was thousands. So it's hard to imagine. So Russia, by biting off bits of Ukraine, taking Crimea and Donbass, shows that Putin is one of those people who would be able to make such a decision. And he demonstrated this before with other countries as well. So I believe it is not just about the neighboring countries. Sure, they have to pay attention to Russian politics and take this into consideration. And Ukraine is very cautious, I would say. Ukraine is closely watching Russia. But also other countries need to pay attention to Russia's aggressiveness. Even though Russia tries to keep this image of a peaceful country. But it doesn't hesitate to attack and grab a piece of another country. And this must be the only case like this in Europe of the 21st century. I tried to find some other examples, but I don't think there is another country which would dare to act like Russia. We need to stop belittling Putin's crimes. We are continuously investigating whether Russia has to do with that aircraft crash. There are always some new questions about what Russia did. However, what we know for sure is that there have been 58 dead journalists during Putin's term of office. We can keep looking for other proofs too. But we should simply use common sense as well and realize that Putin decided to choose this political style. And if you don't believe it, you can read many books about his life. You will probably be shocked after reading all the details. So, from my point of view, it is important to mobilize our courage, and at the same time we need to study this issue and be aware of the broader context. In 1968, compared to the Soviet Union, we were a small country. Of course, the invasion was carried out by the Warsaw Pact, but it was in fact run by the Soviet Union. And as a small country with not much armament, we did not really have a chance. But also, Belarus is much smaller than Russia. Ukraine is smaller too, and so is Georgia, and not so well equipped for the war. Do they have a chance? Well, of course they do have a chance, because we have this ethos of the European Union, which rejects this kind of approach that Russia is taking. We all have hope, as we are united. The Czechs were traumatized by the Munich Agreement, when Western European countries had left us behind without help. But we believe that the solidarity of the Western world and a global solidarity will not allow this anymore. This solidarity applies to our cultural space, including the countries neighboring with Russia. In Europe and in the world, we need to push through the ideas that Russia must not dare do these things. We can't just let it happen. Some politicians keep putting it down, but we need to continue with the sanctions against Russia until Crimea's problems are solved, because this part of the country was stolen. So we need to reject these Russian politics. Ukraine, compared to Russia, is a smaller country, and it is weaker in terms of military. Do you think you have a chance for an independent life? I think that in over than 1,000 years of Ukrainian traditions, we are now at Maidan and many events took place here. I remember when we took to the streets, came to St. Michael's Cathedral, where there were people injured with bullets, or there were surgery operations being done in all the St. Michael's Cathedral, which basically became a surgery centre. There is St. Sophia's Cathedral in front of it, and when celebrating 1,000-year anniversary of the first church service there this year, we saw that the Russian aggressive politics is greatly directed to take away these foundations of Ukrainian history, not just to occupy our territory with tanks and to annex Crimea, but to steal history, as it is impossible to build the new Eurasian empire or to restore the Soviet Union without Ukrainian history. First there was Kiev Rus, and the thing that Ukraine is now trying to get the Tomos about the autocephaly for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is one of the ways of fighting for independence, because, in fact, the mother church, even for the Russia Church, was the Ukrainian Church. So, during these years, we, as Ukrainians, try first to build strong institutions, and secondly, to strengthen our identity. Decommunization is taking place. We banned the Russian social media, such as Vkontakte, Odnoklasniki. We increased the number of songs in Ukrainian, especially patriotic songs, on Ukrainian radio stations. Ukraine now has an army, which is the 8th strongest army of Europe. We started to form it ourselves as volunteers after the Revolution of Dignity and the military invasion of Ukraine. That is why, for Ukraine, the national unity is very important inside the country. The second very important thing is the international solidarity and the continuity of this solidarity, because the latest visits, in particular of Merkel and Macron, to Russia and increasing investments, they remind us that hybrid diplomacy and double standards. We are now very concerned about the construction of the Nord Stream 2, because this is a new geopolitical project, through which Putin is trying to extend his gas monopoly, along with the political monopoly all over the European Union, and to put the countries of Eastern and Central Europe under risk because the Nord Stream 2 will be built bypassing them. So now Ukraine is fighting off the cyber attacks. Last year, you know, there was a well-known attack, Petya virus, which was directed against critical infrastructure of Ukraine, such as the energy sector and banking sector. So, Ukraine is currently a contributor to European security. We have learned in 4 years to counteract. We stopped the broad-scale Novorossiya project. As for Belarus, we remember how Kirill has come to Kiev once, and it was still an activist, when before Kirill arrived, the Kiev City Council was renaming Mazepa Street because Mazepa had an anathema. Because of that, half of the street was renamed from Mazepa to Lavska Street. So at that time, Russia, the Kremlin, took actions to interfere with Ukrainian politics. When the Kremlin was taking an attempt to build the Russian world, it was trying to show that independent Belarus and Ukraine are within their sphere of interests and ideology. That's why this project, Novorossiya, failed, when the Kremlin was not able to destabilize Dnipro, which used to be called Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv, Odessa, with the help of provocations. Let's remember those events that happened in May 2014. So, for Ukraine, now it's very important that the Western society understands that transformation of Ukraine is a long-term process. It does not take 4 years. And even if we achieve those expectations, still, if we take a look at the example of the Czech Republic, or at some attempts, let's say, in Poland, then my appeal and my conclusion will be that if we talk about all the achievements in the countries that became the EU and NATO members, such as our neighbours, Poland, the Baltic countries, the Czech Republic, each new generation does not automatically inherit them. You have to keep fighting for them, because Putin continues to attack the democratic societies, using very intricate mechanisms, using propaganda, bribery, corrupting the politicians, financing the political forces. He's trying to disunite the European Union and destabilize the democracy, returning them to the sphere of his influence. You mentioned the Ukraine's success, and maintaining freedom in Ukraine is a precondition for maintaining freedom in Belarus and other countries. Do you think that the fact that Ukraine rebelled and stood against Russia was something that helped to decrease Russia's appetite for expansion? Did it support freedom in other countries? For example, Belarus? Yes, for sure. You know, once somebody has said that I am a Russophobe, I can't say that I am a Russophobe. Everything I say and do in politics is because of my desires to see another Russia, not today's Putins Russia.
Моїм жаданням бачить іншу Росію, а не сьогоднішню, не путінську. Ось чого я хочу. І коли усі діяння Росії сьогодні зв'язуються з Путіним, то це не так.
That is what I want. We're used to making Putin responsible for all the current actions of Russia. It's not right. There are historical reasons for that. In the 18th century, Catherine II wrote that security of Europe would have to be increased if between Berlin and St. Petersburg or Moscow of those days there had been no other capitals of any other countries. Kyiv, Minsk, and excuse me, Prague. And Russia still continues to execute this peaceful policy.
До Європи Росія поспіхово проводить уже 300-ліття.
Hanna has mentioned Kirill. There is a very important aspect which we shouldn't forget.
Що засероджуємося на світській владі.
Church is power number one, instrument number one.
Національне питання номер один. Ми забуваємо про це.
When in comes to solution of the national question. Everything Hanna said about Kirill, I would say.
Його виступ у Смоленську.
I heard his public speech in Smolensk. I was there with Lukashenko. Then I wasn't in conflict with him. Kirill's speech was devoted to the 80th anniversary of Belarusian Soviet Republic. He, the metropolitan of the church, said on that day, if there are educated people here, and shown it himself, considering himself to be an educated person. Then this educated people know that there is no Ukrainian and Belarusian culture per se. Independent Belarusian or Ukrainian language. There is one great Russian tree on which there occasionally, due to some historical incidents, appeared some branches. And the tree decides what to do, whether to wait until these branches die or get rid of them.
Ці чекать, покуль гэтыя побеги сохнуть, и сами отвалятся. Ці взять их обсекчь. Видите, что нават зала, Смоленск это амаль что Беларусь, нават зала.
Even that audience, rather pro-Russian, Smolensk audience, even they were not welcoming these words. At the same time, the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, stood up and applauded.
Поднялся Лукашенко. І став пляскати у долоні. Я після спитався у його, а чого ти президент?
After that, I asked him, so why are you a president if there is no Belarus? The head of what are you? But those are our personal relations. As for the security of Ukraine and Belarus, I connect it with another thing, another issue, whether the Russian people feel themselves safe in Russia or not.
Безпечно у Росії себе ось гэты самый российский народ. І не один, там же шмат народов живе. Історичний досвід свідчить, що ні.
There are different nations living in Russia, and, according to the historical experience, no. If there even were cases of attack on these nations, they were conducted by the state itself, by Russia. Russia poses threat to itself. It is a threat like a mine or grenade. It has a program for self-destruction, and so it poses danger for itself.
Для самої себе, воно, безумовно, небезпечно і для тих, хто побач. Тому
So for sure, it's dangerous to others, to those who are nearby. That's why, just even for this reason, it is very dangerous to live nearby Russia. And that's why I do not see any perspective for peaceful coexistence. That is the main problem. Even if Putin leaves office, it won't solve this problem. I mean Russian-Ukrainian or Russian-Belarusian problem. But I would like to add this year Georgia, Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic countries have celebrated 100 years, basically, of their independence, having 1,000-year-old histories. If we take a look at the West, many people naively think that when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia changed their imperialistic strategy to seize more countries.
Росія змінила свою імперіалістичну стратегію.
We can remember an old anecdote, a joke from the Soviet Union time. Which countries does the Soviet Union share its borders with? Whatever countries they want. And now we see that Russia, already after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Syria. So Putin constantly creates the points of destabilization in order to try and use it for his own benefit. meaning this is a very aggressive policy. And that is why, in the West, they should understand, as my colleagues have said, that Russia, in hundreds of years, hasn't changed its imperialistic behavior. That's why we have an example of Finland, which was getting ready for potential aggression from their neighbor, Russia, and they managed to withstand it. Regarding Ukraine, when Russian invasion happened, unfortunately at that time, the Ukrainian army was very weak, and we paid a big price for it. The cost was losing 8% of Ukrainian territory. It is now temporarily occupied and 20% of GDP. But those threats also became opportunities to build a strong army, because we understand that with Russia, we always have to be ready for attacks. We started investing more in the strengthening of the position of the Ukrainian language, of the Ukrainian culture. Now we have our own independent cinema, which promotes, in the East as well, the Ukrainian army and its achievements and Ukrainian historical achievements of the hundreds of years of battles. In April, there was 100-year anniversary when the Ukrainian army, led by Bolbokhin, regained Crimea. It happened 100 years ago. So I think, for us, it's very important to build those unions and to have Western solidarity finally cover the countries of Eastern Europe. And I insist on Eastern Europe, not Eastern Partnership. I'm always against that when many EU countries call Georgia, Ukraine and Moldova some kind of buffer or in-between countries, countries that are between aggressive Russia and the European Union or Europe. It is completely unacceptable. The EU and our partners should finally understand that Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, we are a part of the European space, and they should develop those suggestions, transformations and integrations. And this is also a powerful message to Putin, that we are not in the sphere of influence. We are not somewhere in between. And until this policy is realized, we see Mogherini as a high representative of the Union on her visit to Ukraine, visiting the East and calling the Russian aggression, and not the conflict in Ukraine or Ukrainian crisis. So the vocabulary we choose is also important, whether we call things by their names.
Сам vocabulary, словник, який ми підбираємо, він теж важливим є для того, чи називаємо ми речі своїми іменами.
The Ukrainians have fought, and some of them even died for freedom, not far from here. The Belarusians can get imprisoned when they are in opposition, striving for a free country. Putin uses power. He believes that these countries are under his influence, and he will continue until he feels a lot of force. So from what our colleagues from these countries tell us, I think it is calling for help because they are working so hard for their freedom. Some of them even lost their lives. So what will we do? We, as the Western countries. In my opinion, and I'm aware opinions on these issues can vary, we need to look for a solution in a different area. We need to stop to absolutize Putin. He's not a cause. He's just a random figure who happened to become the leader of Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union. There have been no examples of good government in Russia for ages. There was a sort of loosening during Gorbachev's reign. Then we had the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall, revolution and reforms. Then there was Yeltsin and a sort of change. I remember when we were sending the Soviet troops from Czechoslovakia back to Russia, we were thinking of making a dramatic change. We wanted to say that we respect Russian dissidents, who are really brave. We are not Russophobes. However, we disapprove of a certain type of government in Russia, whether it was Stalin or Brezhnev or some other. And in this situation, after Yeltsin, we might have had a democratic leader in Russia, someone who might work on Russia's democracy and develop it, although with some possible difficulties. Yet instead, there came a representative of the past forces, the KGB force, the force that brought bipolarity and a long-term conflict to Europe. And this person embodies these old forces, in a way, represents the return of the Soviet Union. So let's stop looking at Putin as an absolute figure. We need to work with Russian dissidents and citizens, for it is them who have been suffering the most. We should have them here. Of course, they are under terrible pressure and in terrible danger. They might even get killed. But we need them to join us. They are necessary for the solidarity, just like other nations that were involved. We need to make sure that Putin's rule is over with his oligarchs and kleptocracy. It has to end. It is no longer based on ideologies of Marxism or Leninism, but it keeps using the old mechanisms. It is this kind of authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regime, and it is built on bribery and stealing. Putin will never understand or change. We will need a new Russian government. I know this will be very hard for Russia, but this is what Russians need to do, to change the government.
Нельзя сказать, все как бы правильно, и вы сказали правильно, але нельзя сказать, что у России...
Everything is correct, but I would not say that Russia is conservative. It's imperialistic.
Яка непозбежна, вот як її не викручує, її там і Боскою називали, це попи з Кирилом, да? Але вона непозбежно упирається у самодержав'я. Вот так чи інакше це буде форма правління.
Russian idea is based on autocracy, dictatorship. However, there are some changes. When Czechoslovakia was occupied, 6 people in Russia went on a protest. However, up to 10,000 people came out for protests to Bolotanya Square now. So, there are some changes in the Russian society. And I think that anyone, not only Europe, but also neighboring countries, should encourage these changes in Russia. Many problems arise because of misunderstanding what is today's Russia. What Mogherini says today is because of her misunderstanding of what Russia is. The decisions taken by the West, by the USA, which is rather far, for them it's difficult to have a good understanding of the situation. From my point of view, and I have written about that, not only as a politician, but also as a poet. I am also a poet. The October Revolution caused a civil war. One says that the civil war ended in the 1920s with the invasion of Russia to European countries, to Minsk, Vilnius, Prague, Warsaw.
Будем забирать это все. Мински, Вильнюсы, Киевы, Праги, Варшавы. Але она не скончилась. Вот в чем проблема.
However, the problem was that this war hasn't ended. The civil war is still ongoing. Some say that Reds, others Whites. But the real state of things is that neither Reds nor Whites won. If Reds won, there would be communism. If Whites, imperialism. Grey won in the war, and they created the structure in which they felt comfortable until the present day. This phenomenon in Russian domestic and foreign policy is a consequence of the civil war in Russia, which still exists.
Это метастазы этой самой громадянской войны в России, якая по сегодняшний день еще не сконченная. Мы живем у
We are living through hard times, but there are simple things, private, personal family life, desire to bring up children. And for sure, Russians have the same desires and feelings.
выховывать своих детей. Такое жадання, ну ми не можемо позбавити це жадання і тих людей, які живуть у Росії. Вони живуть тими самими почуттями, тими самими жаданнями. Але ось
However, these political ideas make Russians mad, who have started to care about politics more than about human values. When I went to Moscow to attend the Congress for Support of Ukraine, I met my friend on the bridge at the library with whom we studied at university. From the sides, there were two other friends with whom we studied at the Faculty of Literature.
З яким я вчився в одному інституті, а по боках на цьому мостику стоять ще двоє наших сябров, які вчилися в тому ж літературному інституті. І побачивши нас,
they started to shout that we had betrayed the Russian idea, Slavic idea, that they would harm us. They tried to insult me. I should say that they are not common people. They are intelligent. One of them, a dean of the faculty, another, a dean of MGIMO, the Moscow State Institute of International Relations.
Свои сопли, там, правда, ветер крутанул, и это ему назад вернулось. И я ныне вата, а один декан...
I would like to say that there are not only political, but also some psychological problems in the country. We got used today that it's difficult to understand Russia. Today, the situation in Ukraine is even more difficult to understand, especially if one decides to see everything in black and white, that there is Putin, empire, and nothing else.
Линейно, ось Путин, империя и больше ничего.
I will return to our question. They need to pay for the freedom. I forgot to answer this question. Excuse me. How to act.
Про що ви кажете, я правди, от як реагувати, да, на це все. І от емпіричним шляхом вибудувалися.
There are two empirical ways found.
Супростоять. Збройно супростоять этой агрессии, отстаивать свою незалежность, свою свободу.
The first way is Ukrainian. To counteract this aggression, to fight for your land and independence. Another way, Belarusian. Even not Belarusian, but Lukashenko's way. Play with Russia while saying that you love Ukraine, that they are good guys. What we have in result in Belarus? No war. This has become the key propaganda motto, propaganda message. The official authorities say that if you support the opposition, they will start a war, like in Ukraine. That's why better keep calm and not support any dissident. I should be grateful to Ukraine. Maidan. I saw people who were full of freedom. The majority of us, fortunately, there are a lot of young people. However, we lived under totalitarian regime and we had no idea about freedom and human rights. But here, at the Maidan, people had understanding of these things and were struggling for them. This is the only way that can lead to victory. So I will return to the previous question, the need to fight for their freedom. And we, people from Czechoslovakia and other former communist countries, understand what it's like. But it is important that the EU representatives tell the truth. Can they say that this is not just a conflict, it is an act of aggression? Because we should be helping those who fight for freedom. We don't want to let them down, do we? We have collective responsibility for the EU steps. And the idealist political position that includes human rights is always influenced by economic factors. The EU and the USA are afraid to criticize China for violation of human rights. We naturally have to do this, but we have certain problems with that. Slovakia has shown in the most recent events that if the citizens get angry and take activity in their hands, they can actually make a lot of changes. Ukraine has shown this. Belarus is demonstrating it too. But in the Czech Republic, we are not capable of doing it. Because our president is a spokesperson of the Kremlin, which is just incredible. We have the Prime Minister, although not officially approved yet, who will probably be supported by a popular far-right party and the Communist Party that denies and puts down democratic principles. We have this conflict of democracy. Where's the solution? Do we prefer the economic factors? Of course, the economy is important. Of course, there must be a diplomatic, moderate approach. But there also needs to be certain limits, naturally. If the human rights are violated in such a noticeable way, if people get murdered, whether in their own countries or in the EU, these are threats, and the EU needs to name them clearly. Some European politicians tend to do this, while some countries may be still hesitating. However, the challenge for us is relevant. I believe this is not just about the economy. It is important, but it's not the only thing. Talking about the sanctions against Russia, we don't really have problems with them. The Czech and Slovak economies are growing, and yet some people keep saying why we are doing this, and we will only make Russia angry. So what is going on? This really is a huge and complex problem, and in our minds, it has turned into some statistical issues. We can no longer see the human dimension and suffering. There were 58 dead journalists, which is totally outraging. How could we just accept these statistics? We need to finish with this. We need to be strict, and we need to continue with the sanctions until Russia gives stolen Crimea back. There is no other way. We cannot compromise, because otherwise we will accept Russia's approach, and Russia will try and bite off more. It is no longer a tame bear. It is an aggressive bear that can attack you any time. One cannot live in such a world, constantly expecting a possible attack. There is a new pack of problems represented by China. China is massively violating human rights. And again, due to economic reasons, we sort of belittle the problem and refuse to speak about it frankly. I understand that politicians sometimes try to tone it down, but we need the courage to state it clearly. The EU needs to be unified. We need to stick together. Together, we need to stand up against threats. And Ukraine, Belarus, and all other countries that want to liberate themselves from the Russian influence need to be supported by us. It is a somewhat paradoxical situation. Putin seems extremely strong, both in the economic and military sense. But he is not so great. In fact, and the EU is acting like a weak player, which is not true either. It is the other way round. Why do we underestimate ourselves? Turkey is also an important factor here. If you consider the Russian forces and the NATO forces, Turkey is quite important. However, this topic requires a separate discussion, as it is quite complex. It is about Europe's advancement in social and human rights, as well as empathy. When we stand against a severe military force, we find it difficult to deny our social and human rights-based approaches and think of fighting. It doesn't mean we are not strong, though. We just find it very difficult to threaten someone, while Putin finds it very easy to do that. We try to apply the 21st century approach, while he does not hesitate to take the 19th or 20th century approach. Look at US politics and that discrepancy. It has changed from Obama's refined approach, and the EU is not able to stand up against the rise of brutal force. But we would not be afraid to stand up if we had to fight for freedom. No, I have no concerns about this. We are just looking for a right way of doing it. We are looking for the limits, how far this can go. How would Western Europe, the European Union, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, and NATO help Ukraine? What do you expect from us? I believe that first, Georgia should become a NATO member. In this way, it should be one of the powerful signals to Putin, so that he would not think in any way that he can destabilize Georgia in some hybrid way, taking into account that Georgia received Enhanced Opportunities Partnership Program 2 years ago. They have a strong army, which is compliant with all the standards according to the regulations. This will be one of the ways to support. As for Ukraine, we also move towards NATO membership. I hope that the Ukrainian parliament will pass the law on national security, which will comply with NATO criteria, which will include parliamentary and civil control over the defense and security sector. Currently, Ukraine spends 5% of GDP on security and defense. This is more than any NATO member. We have practical experience to fight off the hybrid threats, including cyber threat. So, in perspective, Ukraine should get an action plan for NATO membership as a motivation to speed up reforms in this area. Until that happens, we understand that after Putin is re-elected, he will become even more aggressive towards Ukraine. He will not become a peacemaker. I'm quite skeptical about the UN peacekeeping operation because he will not accept the red lines placed by Ukraine. So we need to think about the formats. For example, bilateral security agreements such as Ukraine, Romania, Ukraine, Poland, Ukraine and the US, Ukraine, Canada, Ukraine and the UK, so that later, based on those bilateral security arrangements, we could have some security trainings together somewhere in central or eastern Ukraine closer to the contact line, and to show this way that until Ukraine becomes a NATO member, the West supports Ukraine, and that any attempts of the escalation that we see through the military drills such as Zapad or West, which were held with Belarus last year, and the next one will take place in 2019. Will they be threatening? Because what happens in Belarus is a crawling occupation, a very latent occupation, but it covers the TV channels. Influence on the political forces and the law enforcement system. I'm not even talking about dependency of the Belarusian economy on Russian oil products, trade, etc. So we need also to keep focused on Belarus. And secondly, I also want to say that the West, especially the EU, the European Commission, should not allow Nord Stream 2, because this is an invitation. For Ukraine, it is an existential threat. It is just an enormous risk of economic losses. It is also an opportunity for Putin to start a full-scale war, because, in that case, European countries will not depend on the gas transit through Ukraine, after we showed that we are a reliable partner for over 50 years. Even the capacities of the Ukrainian gas pipeline network are not used in full, and we need to use those capacities rather than building a bypass. So we need to think what Putin's strategy is like. And his strategy is to capture Europe through destabilization of Ukraine. Also, the support of presidential and parliamentary elections and democracy is important, as well as monitoring them here, because Putin will try to use parliamentary elections to increase the number of representatives in parliament and to destabilize the situation from inside through them. We also need to understand how political processes will be used in a hybrid way. And the key thing is, as a head of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, I would like to ask my colleagues, the diplomats, don't trade with principles, with values, because real Europe is based on respect and values as the first priority. If we start trading values, then, as a result, as it has been once said, we'll have more shame, more war, more losses, and as a result, less stability and less prosperity. Is that what Europe wants? No, I don't think so. And a question for you. What do you expect from the West? You mentioned that Ukraine will find it very helpful if there is a clear way for Ukraine to Western structures such as the European Union and NATO. But Putin claims he would never allow this, and Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. So what will happen next? Is it a question of courage and self-confidence of Western leaders? Do you believe they have it? In 2008, at the Bucharest summit, Ukraine and Georgia were very close to getting the NATO membership action plan. But at that time, some countries, including European countries, were against it. Now, 10 years later, we are closer, thanks to the military training of the armed forces and practical experience. But, at the same time, we are further away from getting the membership action plan. We were told before that our non-bloc status is a guarantee for our security against Russia, but it turned out to be the opposite way. It helped the Russian aggression. So last year, in 2017, Ukrainian parliament put it in a law that now NATO membership is one of the strategic goals for Ukraine. So we'll do everything for that. Pass the laws, strengthen the Ukrainian army, build strong institutions so that one day we become a NATO member, because only such international solidarity, without the grey zones, in between countries when Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia and Belarus will finally be perceived as a part of the European family. And we understand now that after we received an association agreement with the European Union, the free trade agreement and a visa-free regime, we need the EU not to oppose European aspirations of Ukraine, because sometimes even acknowledgement requires a lot of discussions. We don't say we want to be the EU member tomorrow, but we have to have at least this perspective open, because this encourages motivation and mobilization here for progressive forces, for the youth, as a perspective that we need to get ready for. And I am convinced that one day the European Union will ask Ukraine to become an EU member. And I was glad that there was the EU member. And I was glad that there was the EU summit in Sofia, in Bulgaria. And they were talking about new members from the Western Balkans to enlarge the European Union, finally, as a part of the enlargement policy. Because they understand that if the EU doesn't offer anything for some of the Western Balkan countries, this vacuum will be filled by aggressive Russia, the same way as Montenegro became the 29th NATO member, not only as a recognition of their reforms, but as a proactive action and counteraction for the Kremlin, not to have one more spot of hot war or destabilization there.
гарячої війни чи дестабілізації?
More than 10 years ago, Belarus was an important topic for Czech Republic, Slovakia and the rest of Europe. There was hope that opposition would get stronger and Lukashenko would not win. But now, several years later, Belarus is not really talked about much. It feels like there is no hope left. People think Lukashenko will keep winning and there can't be changes in Belarus. How can we help you? What would you appreciate from the Western countries? I would not exaggerate hope for the West. Europe, the US, with full respect and understanding of your desire to improve the situation in Belarus. From my political experience, I can say that the trends in European and American policy have been changing. One of the reasons is political rotation. The situation there is different from Belarus, where Lukashenko is a president for the fourth decade in office. A new person arrives to Brussels or Berlin with a visit and says that there were some idiots in power before him. But he's clever and will fix the situation in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. Then he fails to do that. But another reason is a human factor and also the general state of the world. We have gone through the cultural crisis, the financial crisis. In the US, they've gone through 2 defaults, and nowadays, the administration of Trump is focused on preventing the 3rd default. That's why they are extremely busy caring about their own problems. To Ukraine, there is much more attention than to Belarus. The struggle for independence and sovereignty is going on here. When the war started in Donbass, Ukraine needed weapons, lethal weapons. And there has been a huge discussion whether the US or European Union would provide this weapon. Then I said that the US and EU wouldn't provide lethal weapon to Ukraine. For sure, I do understand that European partners don't want another destabilization here, especially in Belarus. I was involved in the preparation of the Belarusian Maidan before the Ukrainian one. For that, I was actually imprisoned. People were ready to come out to the streets and struggle. But after what's happened in Ukraine, after the change of the European trend, the desire of people disappeared. That's why I think that solidarity is extremely important. The fundamental ideas that I promote, democracy, human rights, they are essential. And it is important to promote them. However, now the discussion of such issues as democracy and human rights have turned into talks over a cup of coffee. Both Ukrainians and Belarusians, after all, will have to rely more on themselves. Now, I would not like to return to the thing I've started talking about. What has happened here at the Maidan is the main event of the 21st century for the whole of Eastern Europe. From this point, the struggle for freedom and independence started. Not to be a kind of country between, but for the Ukrainian state, Belarusian state. And this is the trend which is increasing, and I hope that it will win, and we will achieve what we want. The last question. Try to answer in one sentence, if possible. I asked about your expectations and ours, and now, very briefly, what do we expect from ourselves in this situation?
Tak já jsem předefinoval v poslední době kvalifikovanost.
I redefined things, such as qualification, skills, and popularity, to one word, and that is courage. Because something may be coming and it exceeds our usual capability to deal with things, we cannot really deal with it without courage. I believe that we are waiting for responsible leadership that will be based on fundamental values, because this is the only thing that will keep the European Union together and Europe as a continent. And I hope there will be understanding of the importance of the values in the EU, in the West, in the world. As for us, we need to understand our mission, our simple mission, which is the renaissance of the continent through our courage. We also need to take responsibility to build a strong country. In 1,000 years, Ukraine saw how many empires collapsed. Those empires are in the past, while we are still here. And we need to help the Russian Federation and people there to be inspired by an example of Ukraine and start their own fight and transformation of Russia. Because Putin and Putinism, the same way as the Soviet Union, will disappear one day. And I really hope that one day, in the center of Moscow, as it happened at the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union, when there was a tank with the Ukrainian flag, there is a photo proof. It happened in Moscow in 1991. So I hope that one day in Moscow, instead of the Lenin monument there, will be a monument to the victims of the famine in Ukraine. And in this way there won't be Stalinism, because it is worshipping the devil. But instead there will be the truth, a new Russia, without Putin and Stalin and all those imperialistic traditions, fighting for its future, understanding that Ukraine is an independent and sovereign country and its partner neighbor with equal rights. And the same question to you. Today, it's obvious that the future of mankind is not so joyful and happy as we would like to see. The competition between countries is increasing, competition for access to resources first of all. Our Western partners have their own interests. Moreover, there are various interests within the EU. Different attitudes to the neighboring countries. That's why we have to understand that. We should keep in mind our history, the history when we were united at the times of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. At that time, we were able to struggle for our interest. Not to ask for any help, to defend from different enemies, and we managed to become the most powerful country of Europe. I mean, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. That's why we, Eastern Europe, should be united. And that should be our priority number one. We should improve our relations. As for me, I consider Ukraine our main partner. I try and visit not only Kyiv, but also other cities, Berdikiv, Vinnytsia. Those are different Ukraines. Kyiv is one Ukraine, and Berdikiv, Vinnytsia, another Ukraine. But there is an understanding that this is Ukraine, thanks to the Maidan events. I think we have to strengthen the relations with Western Europe, Belarusian-Ukrainian bilateral relations, understanding the complexity of the situation. and try to find the ways to pursue our mutual interests, primarily Belarusian, Ukrainian, of course.
Наших супольних інтересів. Білорусько-українських найперше.
Thank you.